Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Answers from the Lab, where we share Mayo Clinic knowledge and advancements on the state of testing and science from laboratory leaders and the people who are making it happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Bobbi Pritt, Interim Chair of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. With me today is Dr. Bill Morice, the President and CEO of Mayo Clinic Laboratories. This is our weekly discussion with Dr. Morice, in which we learn about updates in the field of laboratory medicine and pathology.
Hi, Bill. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Bobbi?
Wonderful, as always. Now, you've been traveling a lot, like usual, but I understand that you were recently out in San Francisco at the Danaher AI Summit, right?
Yeah. But thankfully, I'm home for the holidays here. I
Nice.
think things go as planned. But yeah, I was just recently, as of last week, actually in San Francisco for the Danaher AI Summit, which was Danaher's, of course, the diagnostics company that is, has really grown over the last several years, 10 plus years. They've acquired a lot of different companies that we're familiar with, like Beckman Coulter. But then they also host these summits for areas that they think are of interest, because they also invest in life sciences and other things. And so it's, even though it's Danaher sponsored, it's many external speakers that they bring in with an invitation only audience to kind of dive deep into what they see as important topics for healthcare and for biotech. And so they decided AI was the topic for du jour, if you will. So yeah.
Wow. Well, it's definitely the topic du jour. If you think about it, I've actually just been reading about how generative AI applications are starting to replace traditional internet search engines, and people are creating large language models that they've customized to fulfill their needs. So they create like a virtual assistant. It's growing
Yeah.
quickly. So for
Yep.
laboratory medicine and just the field in general, can you share some of the main things you learned?
Well, yeah. So it's super. It was very interesting, and they had quite an array of speakers, and you can see why they would hold it in San
Hmm.
Francisco, because a lot of this is happening in that part of the world, really, not just for the country.
Sure.
The opening talk and keynote was from Eric Topol, who many people are familiar with. He's very active. He's a physician scientist. I think, yeah, he's in the West Coast in California, but very active, prolific writer of both in books and other things, and has been focused on this topic. Member of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was quite telling just how much is happening. So I think the kind of the headline is, so much is happening so quickly. I mean, just the pace, with, to your point, with which these things are. I mean, it was only 3 years ago, really, that or a couple of years ago, we first really even heard about these things. And he pointed out that in like the last month, there were 12 new large language models that were published in peer-reviewed literature related to
Mm.
healthcare, right? And just how much this is going to really change over time, how healthcare is thought about and delivered, how we need to train physicians and scientists and any healthcare professional, including lab professionals. I mean, to me, that was really the take home. Number
Mhm.
one, is, wow, this is coming so quickly. The other thing there's a whole host of thoughts that, as you're going through, it was interesting. When someone asked, it was Dr. Philippakis, I think is his name. He's at the Broad now. He's a cardiologist that's been in this space for a long time. And there was a question around, so what's the most uh, biggest impact that you would say that you've seen that you might not have predicted? And he said, oh, it's certainly around drug discovery. And we can talk about that, right?
Mhm.
AI and drug discovery is really changing the whole process of how therapeutics are thought about and innovated on and with. And then they asked for his biggest disappointment, which I thought was interesting. And
Yeah.
his biggest disappointment was clinical decision support. So you think
Huh.
about the very tools like we talk about, right? That really, these have not really been developed and implemented. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing that was interesting, and from just a sort of a nerdy perspective, is, what was the genesis of all this? Where did all this come from? And it actually came from something which I kind of noticed, but not really, a few years ago, and that was AlphaFold. So remember, there was a big
Yeah.
announcement about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that they had developed a program that could predict the tertiary structure or secondary and tertiary structure of proteins based on amino acid. That was actually where the computing power to develop large language models came from. So it was pretty remarkable. I'll stop there. I have other thoughts, but I'll pause.
Interesting. Well, you just reminded me, Bill. I'll put in a shameless plug for a four-part article series on generative AI that talks about AlphaFold and the origins of generative AI, going back to early chatbots and how it's evolved. It's all four articles are available in Archives of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology online right now, and they'll be published as a special edition in February. So keep an eye out for those. There's one on AI, generative AI in education, one addressing the significant ethical challenges associated with generative AI, one on clinical pathology, and then I was a senior author on the introductory article. So,
Wow.
yeah, there's a lot going on in the space, like you said, and it's changing so quickly. Actually, I just read another article about ChatGPT's now onto its next iteration. So,
It's crazy.
it's crazy. So I guess we all have to, you read something and then it's out of date a month later and there's something new. But that's very interesting about your insights. So yeah, what else did you want to share with us today?
Well, and I think we kind of bringing it home on the laboratory a little bit more, is like
Mm-hmm.
on the one side, what was discussed that we now have today that we didn't have in the past, that's really causing this acceleration. And it's the vast amounts of data, number one,
Yes.
that are being created, ever increasing pace, and then the computing power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the computing power continues just to go up and up and up. Another big mover in this space is actually NVIDIA, which is kind of hard to believe because they started as a gaming chip processor company, but now had to develop the speed to do all the stuff in healthcare. And that you think about the labs, right? And of course, there's a reason why Danaher was having this summit, because they want to learn too. So the labs are really thinking about this, and the diagnostic manufacturers are really thinking about, okay, well, what do we do with all this data being generated off of our platforms? It does raise ethical concerns that was discussed quite a bit. On the one hand, you worry best about even the whole concept of consent and consent to your data. What does that really mean?
Mm-hmm.
There was a lawyer that argued that, and does informed consent, is that really meaningful to people? Can people really be informed with the power of these? Can they really provide that, or does protection need to happen more at a government kind of with more legislative or legal kind of positions by governments to protect the citizenry? Because those things, that the concern on haves and have-nots, that people that have access to the resources will continue to develop these tools, and that our healthcare deserts will only get more deserty, more dry.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot there. It's cool. One of the really cool presentations was from an individual talking about how she's actually a pediatric specialist. I can't remember precisely the subspecialty, but they've used these tools to actually develop algorithms to show where, like if you're a physician that want to go help, like in an under-resourced setting, both domestically and abroad, you can go in with your credentials and it'll actually tell you where in the world your services could be needed, what kind of agency to contact. So they're trying, the whole group trying to get, using AI for those who want to kind of contribute philanthropically with their skills to other parts of the world. So there's a lot of good happening with it too. It's just like anything. There's a lot of good. There's a lot of concern. The other thing that's interesting, I think, very much from a lab side is, we've heard a lot about this, and there was a discussion of diagnostics and digital pathology. You ask yourself, well, why is drug discovery? Why is that the area where there's so much focus? And it's because that's where the return is, right?
Yeah.
If a pharmaceutical company already spending, hundreds of millions of dollars on drug development, they can do it faster and better. The return is obvious. On the clinical side, on the diagnostic side, it's not as much. I mean, even digital pathology was talked about. The individual from Harvard that's developed the large language model for pathology diagnostics was there and talking about, well, once this gets them used, it's going to really drive, people to digital pathology. I mean, we know from our own experience at Mayo Clinic, digital pathology has a lot of promise. It's also super expensive. And so
Yeah.
it's right. And there's no special reimbursement. There's no fee code that we as pathologists can charge for that. Same for like the tools that we might use in the clinical lab, right?
Mhm.
Getting reimbursed for a new test. So that's why I think the clinical adoption is going to be slower, just because they're still expensive, and the return is still there, and there's cultural differences too. There's one other thing I was going to point out, but then I'll stop for just for a second.
Oh, well, this is all fascinating, Bill, and there's so many good points here. First of all, just the fact that there was a pediatrician there talking about what is going on in her field makes me think definitely need pathologists in this space as well, working together at the table, because I've seen a lot of clinical patient-facing algorithms for patient-facing applications that use lab data.
Yes.
And we have to be at the table to make sure that they're using the correct data, that they're interpreting it correctly, that we have a say in how that's used. And then the ethical issues are quite interesting too, and how it may actually provide some challenges. It may make our healthcare deserts drier, more deserty.
Yep.
I like that. Uh, but I also wonder, though, does it bring in opportunities to deliver care in places where they don't have that expertise? You and I have talked about how we use artificial intelligence in my lab for ova and parasite exam. That eventually has the potential to bring in skills for laboratories that otherwise wouldn't have staffing and expertise.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It has the
potentials and challenges, right?
Yes, it has the opportunity to scale knowledge to make healthcare more accessible in parts of the world where there's where the expertise is just lacking. I mean, that's really, I mean, good healthcare is about doing things with high quality and getting the right data to the right person, and that can help
Mhm.
make a decision on your health and well-being. So, but the other thing I was going to point out, which came out as I was there, was literally hot off the press, was a study using, I think, about 50 physicians, and half of whom were established general practitioners, and half of them were trainees, residents. And they had three groups. They had a group that they said just use your computer, using like test cases, like in a RISE exam, where you had to see a patient, look at the data, and come up with a differential. And so, but not a real patient, it's simulated. And so they had one group of that got access to the conventional tools, so they could look at UpToDate and other stuff. They had another group that had an AI tool, a Chat GPT type tool that they could use, and then they also ran Chat GPT alone. And so then the results just came out. Those who, and it was time bound too. So I mean, it was a lot of artificiality to it, right? You had to set an hour to get through 7 cases, et cetera, et cetera. You had to write down what your differential was and what was the data supporting it against each entity. Those who just used conventional tools got about 75% right.
Okay.
Around 70%, somewhere in there. Those who use Chat GPT, no difference in performance, about 70%.
Huh.
Chat GPT alone was 90+%. So,
Wow.
this whole idea that we keep hearing, like, the machine, what is it, the human in the network, or human in the loop. That's
Yeah.
how it's
Yeah.
going to
Human in the loop.
human in the loop. And so there was quite a bit of head scratching. I think some of the
Huh.
people at least knew about that study, were there, and were surprised by the results. But you know what? It's artificial, number one. It doesn't mean
Hmm.
computers are better, number two. But it does show that we're going to have to rethink how we train people, because there were some that just didn't believe. They actually overrode the what was suggested. There were some that just didn't know how to use it, and they did not
Yeah.
really specifically train people how to use it. But then there were some that overrode it, and I think it really goes to, like, how you've implemented in your lab. You saw the opportunity. You got engagement of the lab professionals to actually look at and understand. So this whole idea of explainability and
Hmm.
black box, and so I think we're going to have to really rethink medical education, but and help and education of our laboratory professionals, because this is going to be it's going to be part of our work. And so, yeah, it's not just thinking about how it's used, like, in front of a patient, but even just in our work, how we do it, and really being involved, like embracing the technology and understanding it. I think that's really what I took away from that.
I I have similar thoughts. That's a very interesting study. And you're right, we're going to have to train people. If you think of it like a tool, every tool has its limitations. So we have to train our students, our residents and fellows, and our existing attendings, pathologists and colleagues how to use the tool. But then you need to know what the limitations are. For example, maybe the tool is really good at making a certain type of diagnosis, but struggles in other areas. And that perhaps is where the human needs to also pull in additional sources. And so that's going to
Yes.
be very interesting. Yeah, there's
Or
so many.
and with the
Yeah.
programmers, because the other piece of it is you have a lot of like, there was a comment made by Dr. Topol actually talking about the individual that wrote the large language model for pathology diagnosis, and said, I talked to this person, he knew more about pathologists than any pathologist I ever met, and he's not a pathologist. He's a, I'm like, well, probably not entirely accurate then.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, there's people with great computing knowledge that see what they perceive as problems to create a solution for. But those of us in the work have also have a lot of insights into how to create a tool that helps us solve our problems, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, even for something like that, maybe someone that's like writing a chat GPT or a large language model needs to sit down with someone like a Dr. Pritt and say, so Dr. Pritt, when you're talking me through how when a resident comes into your case with an office, how you probe them to understand their thinking behind that case so you can help guide them, right? So maybe, because that's how they're designing these things. So maybe they have to think about how we interact. Or when we sit down with a lab tech and the lab tech comes with a question to us, how do we interact with them and how do they want to interact with us? Because we're now going to be interacting with machines to help us deliver this knowledge. So that was my other thought. There's a whole side to what we do every day, which I don't want to lose, number one. And hopefully these tools will make it so we can actually have more of those interactions. But at some point, we're going to have to interact with the tools in the way that we interact with each other for them to really be valid.
Yeah, I agree. It's a fascinating topic. I could keep going on about it. I will add one thing. You're right about there not being any active CPT codes that people can use for billing for digital pathology. But I just pulled up some information I have on the new Category 3 CPT codes, and there are 43 digital pathology add-on Category 3 CPT codes that are basically just used at this point for, well, they're temporary codes for emerging technology. So people should hopefully be using those because this will allow collecting data. There's no relative value units associated with them or established payment, but that'll come too. So people should
Exactly.
hopefully start using those codes. I'll put the plug out there, use these codes for digital pathology. And at some point, hopefully there will be reimbursement. But you brought up that great point of a lot of these things are really cool and the places that are large and the haves versus the have-nots, they're going to be working with these tools. But how does everyone be able to use them if there's not reimbursement and they're expensive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's lots of unanswered questions, lots of
Mhm.
promise, lots of unanswered questions, which means we'll get to talk about it more.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing your insights, Bill. That was really interesting.
Well, thanks
And
for sharing
this
yours
will
as well.
be a future topic for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, until next time. See you
Until next
later.
time. Take care.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Answers from the Lab. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and don't forget to tune in every Thursday and every other Tuesday.